States, with the exemption of all border states and northern states who still believed in the slavery use. So that would include states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri.
Can you highlight this on your PowerPoint, please? Emancipation Proclamation allowed for the first time black men to fight. And here's an actual poster from the time period.
So Captain Robert Goulshaw, not knowing at a young age what to do with himself in life, failing out of school, not knowing what career to follow, found a purpose when the war broke out in 1861. He joined the 2nd Massachusetts, starting off as a lieutenant and then being elected amongst his men to be the captain of the company. Served in 2 battles, and then Antietam actually gets wounded badly enough that they actually sent him home to recover back at home in Massachusetts. While he was home, he was at a social function where the governor and his father, both very involved in being abolitionists, decided that he would be a good representative from the state to be in charge of the first black troops from Massachusetts, being the 54th Massachusetts. So they field promoted him to being a colonel of the regiment.
So, guys, what's abolitionist? What's an abolitionist? No?
A rich man?
No, not a rich man, but I have a
Anti-slave.
abolitionist under somebody who what?
Is anti-slave.
Excellent, thank you, sir. Can you guys highlight abolitionist, please, in your PowerPoint? Okay, abolitionist. It's a vocab word that you really should know. Abolitionist, okay?
So like I said, he was with the governor, which was John A. Andrew, and his father, deciding to raise black troops from the state of Massachusetts, being the first one being the 54th Massachusetts. Being a volunteer army, it was mostly being made up of already freed black men and then a few that were freed slaves. And as I stated, he was promoted quickly through the rank to be a colonel. You had to be a colonel to actually, in the formation of a regiment, the colonel was the highest ranking officer in that regiment. So within the 54th Massachusetts, there were 2 sons, the 2 sons of Frederick Douglass, both served in the 54th Massachusetts.
Stop, guys. Who's Frederick Douglass? Who?
Escaped slave.
Yep, and what did he do?
Becoming an abolitionist.
He was like one of the biggest voices, and he would have meetings with President Lincoln constantly. And that Andrews that he talked about, the governor of Massachusetts, he worked really hard to try to make things better, right? Excellent. And you probably never heard of this person, Sojourner Truth. Maybe you haven't heard of this person. I know I sure didn't until I started studying a little more history. But she was super important. She was a woman's right advocate. She was an abolitionist. She was also a poet. And her grandson actually joined up in the 54th. So I want you to see that the abolitionists didn't just talk about being free. They wanted to make things better. So obviously Frederick Douglass couldn't go. He was quite old at the time. And so his sons went. Okay.
Already fighting, initially taking the command to appease his mother and father. Saul eventually grew to respect his men because he didn't actually trust that they'd actually be used for any sort of fighting or combat. But he was eager to actually be able to take his men out and prove them in combat. Initially, their pay was supposed to be the same as a white regiment. being $13 a month. Well, they were only told that they were going to get $10 a month. So when the men found out they were going to be paid $3 less, they ripped up their pay slips to receive their pay. Colonel Shaw, deciding to be amongst his men with that, also ripped his own and did not receive pay. And so did all the other officers within the regiment. And then they started boycotting to try to demand equal pay for the men, which they actually do not end up receiving until after the war.
And the uniforms, they wouldn't give them uniforms like they would for any other regiment.
They backlogged all their requests for any equipment and uniform supplies, so it took them forever to be able to receive anything. And it took a lot of force to actually get any equipment or gear they actually needed. May 28th, 1863, Colonel Shaw takes the 54th through on a triumphant march through Boston over to the docks to proceed their journey down south to be part of the war. Once they were received in James Island, once they were received down in the south, they were not actually used for any combat whatsoever initially. They were used for manual labor, which is what Colonel Shaw thought his guys were always going to just end up doing, was manual labor. Finally, they got their chance to see some combat on July 16th, 1863 on James Island with a skirmish against some Confederates. And being able to hold their own ground, were victorious.
Can you guys highlight for me manual labor and James Island, July 16th, 1863? The point of that is, we're going to see on the next slide, 2 days later, almost a half of the regiment will be destroyed. So just 2 days, they didn't get any rest in between. And they were courageous. That whole regiment was courageous.
Well, like she said, 2 days later, July 18th, 1863, they were the leading force on the assault of Fort Wagner, which is near Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Wagner stood on Morris Island, guarding the approach to Charleston Harbor. It is a massive earthwork fort, so that means that the amount of wood used to actually make the fort is very minimal. Most of those are just for protection of the fort. So this is technically a dug into the ground fort, or dirt that's piled higher, making it harder to approach. So
There's just another picture to show you
another
that they
picture.
had to climb up.
So like I said, minimal amount of wood. The wood is literally on the baseline of that slope, preventing people from being able to get to that bottom end and come up.
And you can see there was a marsh here and an ocean here. There was only one path to go. They didn't have a very easy time of it.
So since the walls were made of sand, actually, dirt and sand, the Union artillery spent an entire day bombarding the fort, trying to soften it to make it easier for advance of infantry. So after an entire day's worth of firing, they actually did not do a whole lot of damage to the fort to make it any easier to approach. So at 7:45 p.m. the attack commenced. The Union troops had to go about 1,200 yards down the beach of the stronghold, facing the hail of bullets from the Confederates. Like I said, the 54th Massachusetts was the first regiment to make the advance, in which case they were going to take the heaviest casualties, being the first group to the fort. So the same day, attacking the fort, Colonel Shaw was killed in action, bravely urging his men forward. After the battle was over, Fort Wagner still stood under Confederate control, and so they buried all the dead in mass graves. And they buried Colonel Shaw with his men thinking it would be an insult to him of being a white officer being buried with black men. His father, when they got the chance to be able to resume his body and bring it back to Massachusetts, they asked his father if that's what he wanted to do, and he said no. He said Shaw would be happy to be buried with his men. It was the right place and the honor of being buried with them. The flag is a very important deal within a regiment. Anything you do as far as regimental formations and everything is all involved around the flag. So in 1900, Sergeant William Harvey Kearney was awarded the Medal of Honor, the first black man to be honored the Medal of Honor.
Actually, he was the first person to get it, but he got it in 1900, so they didn't recognize him until 40 years later. But he was the first person that should have earned it. Other people did earn, other black men did earn it before he got his medal, but he was the first person. Does that make sense? Okay. Does that make sense?
So, so he earned the Medal of Honor. The reasoning behind that is because the initial flag bearer was shot and killed, and instead of letting the flag hit the ground, he advanced forward, grabbed the flag, and kept going. It says, "Boys, the old flag never touches the ground." By the end of the war, almost 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union Army and freedom.
All right, you guys, and then there's just a short little video, and then I'm going to have James show you some.